Hey there, historians. It's Mrs. Tyler. Today we're going to do Unit 4, Notes 5, Part 3, The Great War. Let's finish this war up. At the start of World War I, European militaries approached warfare the way that they had fought in the 19th century. However, it didn't take long to realize this war is going to be way different. The Industrial Revolution had changed the way that we lived, and now it's changing the way that nations fought. The traditional cavalry is phased out for the use of tanks. Airplanes had been invented, just 15 years before, and now they were used for scouting and then fighting. Submarines were firing torpedoes at iron ships. The machine gun could fire multiple rounds in just seconds, and armies were using barbed wire to fortify their trenches. Poisonous gases like mustard gas increased the death toll. All of these are new inventions in what we call like our first modern war with World War I. It came with great changes. We no longer ride in on horses with a cavalry. We're going to ride in tanks. Airplanes are going to be used for at first just to scout out, and then they're going to start having dogfights and battles in the air. Submarines and torpedoes are going to be used in battles at sea. Poisonous gas and improved weapons increase the death toll. It's early morning on the Western Front, and you're standing at your post in the trench ready for a potential German attack. Your adrenaline is rushing, and you fearfully await what's coming. You decide what weapon you should choose. Warfare had changed. We had all these new technologies. It did not speed up the war or finish it faster. It just killed more people more effectively, and that trench warfare had created a stalemate. No sides had been moving for long periods of time. New weapons, new methods of fighting was that trench warfare, poisonous gas, machine guns, tanks, flamethrowers, airplanes, submarines, landmines, all that kind of stuff. So in your on the game page, would you please pick a number and find out which weapon you choose? If you chose number 1, you are manning a machine gun. If you chose number 2, you choose chemical gas. If you choose number 3, you're manning a howitzer. I'll show you what a picture of that looks like. It's kind of like a cannon on steroids. If you chose number 4, you're going to use a flamethrower. And if you chose number 5, you are going to use a tank. Okay, here's some of the first machine guns that were used during this war. These guys are aiming at the sky because they're trying to shoot down some of those low-flying original airplanes. Okay. This is a howitzer. Like I said, a kind of a cannon on steroids. They were massive. Airplanes were used for the first time in battle, having been invented about 15 years before the war. Tanks, originally they came in this really funky shape, and they were not fully enclosed. I mean, if you think about it, these were replacing the original cavalry that were riding in on horseback. So people were not enclosed on horseback, so they didn't necessarily think that they should be enclosed in this contraption either, but ultimately this funky shape is not going to work out so well. They're going to be very top heavy, and if they roll over any large like craters in the ground, which happen when you're having big blasts and earth gets moved and lots of muddy messes that are really tough to get through, or going through trenches, that front end would get really top heavy, and then nose would just get trapped down into those trenches. By the end of the war, they're going to look a little bit different. So you'll see that they're a little more armored, and they switch the way that that they drive. They're not like pointy on the front like that and top heavy. They'll go over. They'll be able to drive over some of those trenches. Barbed wire was used to basically catch people and get them tangled up. The term "don't leave me hanging" came from this part of warfare where if you were sent out into no man's land and you got caught up on barbed wire, you became kind of a prime target for snipers and gunshot. So you didn't want to be left hanging on the wire. Okay, barbed wire was crisscrossed everywhere and used up by both sides. Flamethrowers, chemical gas, chlorine gas basically killed you, but you couldn't most people just didn't survive that. Tear gas could cause blindness. Mustard gas left horrific blisters on the skin, could cause blindness. Also, if you breathe that in, you could get blisters on the inside in your trachea, in your lungs, in your throat, in the inside of your mouth as well. It's terrible stuff. You can see those blisters from. Okay, it causes chemical burns. So on this page for number 10 at this bottom, some of the new technologies of World War I want you to list some of them down. You should have included some examples of like poison gas, machine guns, tanks, flamethrowers, airplanes, submarines. You could have included the barbed wire fencing, things like that. In the average battle, 100,000 men could die. An industrialized war meant it had massive casualties. Many soldiers experienced what we now have labeled as post-traumatic stress disorder. We talked a little bit about this as being called, in the Civil War, they called it soldier's heart, just like in the book, The Soldier's Heart by Eric Paulson, that was read to you, most of you guys, in 6th grade, about Charlie Goddard. You know that he survives the Civil War, but comes back really, really shattered and broken mentally. And in World War I, we end up calling it shell shock. Some symptoms of shell shock were those staring eyes, like looking past people, violent tremors, blue, cold extremities, unexplained deafness, blindness, or paralysis. Just not being able to cope with normal everyday life. Kind of like a crazed look like that guy's got, that glassy-eyed staring off, not really with it. There were a lot of, this World War I is going to usher in kind of this new era of medical advancements in terms of facial reconstruction and also other reconstructive surgeries. Because of the kind of deformities that men would come home with after these wounds, like being burned, these big explosions, those howitzers being shot down. And normally, if your airplane crashed, you could walk away because you weren't flying at super high altitudes, but the biggest cause of death was if your plane started on fire, or if you were shot down over enemy territory. So some massive advancements because of this war in facial reconstructive surgeries and other reconstructive surgeries. We talked about it during the Civil War as well, but World War I is not much different. There's large number of men who have to have limbs amputated because of this war for various reasons, whether it's landmine explosions, drastic burns, severe trench foot could have a situation where you had to cut off part of the foot or all of the foot. So there were quite a few reasons why people would lose a limb in this war. Russia's monarchy had been overthrown. The new communist government made peace with Germany. Germany then is no longer fighting on two fronts. They race the German troops that had been fighting on the Russian or Eastern front, and they can divert them all to fighting against the Western front along the French border. So now France and British troops are they're hit with basically the full brunt of Kaiser Wilhelm's army for Germany. They are able to get within 50 miles of Paris, and United States troops had arrived in June of 1917 and helped push the Germans back and keep them from taking Paris. U.S. General John J. Pershing was dissatisfied with the harsh reality once he brings U.S. troops into this in 1917. He gets there and he's like, you guys, this has not been working for you for the last 3 years, and we have to change strategies. So in June of 1918, Pershing, along with over 1 million American troops, began a more carefully coordinated offensive attack. They would take all of these new advances, like the trenches and the airplanes and the howitzers, and they would orchestrate them to all be going on at the same time for massive coordinated attacks. And they took the Germans by surprise. Taking advantage of all these new technologies and utilizing them in a far more efficient manner for a more aggressive, offensive attack instead of being just content to sit in these trenches and just fighting a defensive war that hadn't gotten anybody anywhere. So instead of risking having their own country invaded, German leaders agreed to an armistice or a ceasefire on November 11th, so the 11th day of the 11th month at 11:11 a.m. in 1918, and the fighting officially ended in World War I. So in class, to finish up our simulation game, students took one piece of white paper and we tore it into fourths. On one piece of the paper, we write "you survive." On another piece of the paper, we write "you die" in battle. And then on the other two pieces, you're supposed to write two different scenarios that might happen to someone in battle, like an arm blown off, trench foot, going deaf from explosions, shell shock, all kinds of the things that we just talked about. And then we had an actual battle. We crumpled all four of those pieces of paper into little balls, and we got down in between our tables into the trenches, and we threw our ammunition during the battle. And then each student picked up a one of the balls off the floor, and that's what ended up happening to them. Okay. So, November 11th, 1918, an armistice is signed. Fighting stops. Hopefully you made it out safely using the paper ball you picked up as a note. What happened to you in the last battle of the war. Let's look at the aftermath. Even before the armistice was declared, President Wilson had been formulating a plan to make World War I the war to end all wars. Well, we know that that was not an effective, it didn't work. We've definitely fought wars since World War I. Wilson drafted a plan he called the 14 points. He makes a list, basically. The first 5 points deal with preventing nations of the world from getting caught up in the factors that led to World War I in the first place. The main causes of World War I plus what brings the United States into the war. So we've got the militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And then what brings the United States in is that interfering with shipping and trade in the high seas, and that unrestricted submarine warfare. Points 6 through 13 deal with the ethnic divisions in Europe. A lot of the countries that had been taken over by some of those big empires, like the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were wanting to govern themselves. There were different ethnic groups that wanted to be able to decide for themselves how they were going to live and not be governed by someone else. So Wilson wanted to address this, but his biggest impact was the 14th point. He calls for the formation of an organization called the League of Nations, where countries would work together to work out their differences and try to guarantee world peace. Okay, but members of Congress in the United States reject this plan. They do not let the United States become a member. Many Americans wanted to go back to being isolationists. They didn't want to have our country bound to other nations through such an organization. Many members of Congress felt it was unconstitutional because the Constitution is the highest law of the land, and it protects the voice of the right of the governed to be a part of the decision-making process. We, the people, give permission to our leaders to govern us, and the United States voters would not have any say in any of the things that the United Nations, or that means the League of Nations, would decide. So many of members of Congress rejected, and we vote to not become a member of our own president's idea to try to keep world peace. So he's sad. Did you see his tears? There it is. Oh. Okay, so in notes on page 15, Wilson gave or maybe it's 14. Wilson gave a 14-point proposal for world peace, calling for free trade, no secret alliances, and forming the League of Nations. Okay. And then on page 12, we're going to highlight the organization for League of Nations, an organization formed using Woodrow Wilson's ideas to promote world peace after World War I ended, but it's rejected by U.S. Congress. And then we'll identify this last little piece that we had left open in our notes earlier about Woodrow Wilson creating the League of Nations, but our own country does not join. These are the big four. I'll identify these guys in a minute. This is U.S. President, though. Wilson's 14 points was a flop for the United States, but it sounded perfect for those war-weary European nations who were trying to avoid another big war like this. Millions of people turned out to cheer for Wilson when he arrived in Paris to attend the peace conference. The Big Four leaders met to discuss the terms of peace. Wilson's plan sounded nice, but most countries wanted to punish Germany for their role